In this video, we're going to be just introducing a model for the aggregate demand and aggregate supply to explain these short-run fluctuations or business cycle movements that we see in economies. Now, what you're familiar with so far is a long-run classical theory. So, if you recall, we had talked about previously terms like classical dichotomy, which referred to the theoretical separation of nominal and real variables, and also the term monetary neutrality, that referred to the fact that money is neutral in the long run, that money does not affect real variables in the long run. Okay, but what we know is that money does affect real variables in the short run. And that's why you have the Federal Reserve, because they try to, using monetary policy, they try to affect or try to intervene and get us out of recessions, for example. So for short-run fluctuations, we need a different type of a model, which is called the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. And that's what this chapter is going to be focused on. Now, in this model, we're going to have on the x-axis the quantity of real output, okay? And this is just Y. This is our real GDP Y on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, we have some sort of a price level. This is like the price level could be a GDP deflator or CPI, which is telling you about the overall level of prices in the economy. Now, we're going to have one demand curve or one aggregate demand curve. This is aggregate demand because we are talking about the entire macroeconomy. We're not talking about this in a microeconomics framework anymore, because we are focused on talking about the entire or the whole economy. And we're going to have two types of supply curves, two types of aggregate supply curves. One would be called a short-run aggregate supply curve, which is upward sloping, which is the red line here, and the long-run aggregate supply curve, which is vertical here in blue. So your green is your aggregate demand curve, and the red and the blue are aggregate supply curves. In the chapter, we are going to talk about why do these curves look the way they do. So in this video, we're going to be just introducing the model framework for aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We're going to be talking about one aggregate demand curve in this chapter and two types of aggregate supply curves. Now, if you recall from chapter 4, which was just sort of the microeconomic fundamentals of demand and supply, you would remember that when we drew demand and supply, we had on the on the x-axis, output or quantity. Okay, so we have here quantity, and on the y-axis we had price. Okay, now when we take this idea to the macroeconomic framework, the idea is the same, but now we are talking about the entire economy. So on the y-axis, we will be talking about some sort of a price level, which is like, so here the price level is something like the GDP deflator or the CPI, which is a price index giving us an understanding of the overall level of prices for many, many, many goods, right? And on the x-axis, we have quantity of output and quantity of, in fact, real output, I should say. And this is your real GDP. Now, when we draw the demand curve, that's going to be downward sloping. And this is not demand, but this is aggregate demand because we're talking about the macroeconomy. And our aggregate supply curve is of two types. You have a short run aggregate supply, which is upward sloping, and you have a long run aggregate supply, which is a vertical line. The intersection of the aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply gives you the short run equilibrium, and the intersection of all of these three give you the long run equilibrium. Okay, so in this case we have P star, which clears the market, and we have Yn. I'll tell you why I'm calling this Yn. Yn is the natural level of output. Okay, so this is like what is the level of output in the long run? What is the full employment level of output? But we'll be talking more about this in later videos. Now, this type of a model of aggregate supply and aggregate demand is used to explain economic fluctuations. And the model can be graphed with the price level measured by the CPI or GDP deflator on the vertical axis and the real GDP on the horizontal axis. The aggregate demand curve is just showing you the quantity of goods and services that households, firms, and the government and customers abroad wish to buy at each level of price. And it is downward sloping. The aggregate supply curve shows the quantity of goods and services that firms produce and sell at each price level. So it slopes positively in the short run because the price level and output adjust to balance aggregate supply. And this model, sort of looks like your microeconomic supply and demand model, but the reasons for why the slopes look like the way they do are very different. And we will discuss more about the aggregate demand in the next video.